Okay, Wendy, to get started, I'd just be curious to ask, what was your initial motivation for becoming a therapist?
Initially, I think I would say that some of the kind of experiences that I think about when I'm asked that question is being an only child, which I think kind of helps you to be reflective a little bit. It gives you the opportunity to be reflective, whether you take it or not. That's another matter. But the ability to be reflective of self. Having been teased at school because of my stammer gave me the sense of being reflected about psychological wounds, having an interest in languages at school, but recognizing that, particularly for somebody who stammered, being interpreter is not going to be that great, and there's going to be very little money in translating Latin. So I decided that ain't going to work. And so I kind of, my father wanted me to be a lawyer. He used to say, son, there's only two types of lawyers, rich ones and millionaires. And I said, well, that may be the case, Father, but I'm not interested in the law. So he said, what are you interested in? And I said, well, psychology. And so I kind of got into therapy through psychology. And then it was really about what did I want to do? I did a PhD. And then rising out of that, I got, my ideas about utilizing psychological kind of ways of thinking and application to help people kind of started to form in my mind. And then I started training and the rest, as they say, is history.
It's really interesting. Okay, so I think just to get started now, Wendy, could you maybe just give us a brief introduction into what single session therapy is and why you've developed it?
Well, first of all, I do have to point it out. I didn't develop it. Well, I didn't create it. I think I may have actually helped to spread the word particularly in Britain. But I think that its roots, although there are kind of historical kind of points here and there. For example, Freud did a couple of single sessions on his holiday, on his vacation. People would find out that the great Sigmund Freud was on vacation, and they would always sort of nudge him to kind of see their aunt or their, daughter, so he did a couple of those. He saw Mahler, the composer, for a long walk along a river in Leiden, hence helping to develop both single session therapy and walking therapy at the same time. But he never actually transferred that from his holiday to his normal practice. I think he kind of bracketed it off. That's my kind of vacation type of helping. So there's been spots there, but then I think most people would point to the work done by initially an Israeli psychologist called Moshe Talman and his colleagues at the Kaiser Permanente, a clinic in Northern California, Michael Hoyt and Robert Rosenbaum. Talman had come to the Kaiser Permanente clinic from his private practice in Israel, where he was used to seeing a small number of patients long term. And so in working with this clinic, what he found out after working there for a while, that about 200 of his clients only turned up once. And he thought, what am I suddenly a bad therapist? What's going on? He discussed it with some colleagues and they were saying, well, they're not psychologically minded around here. So he took the unusual step of actually telephoning all 200 of them and found out that in fact, that most of them, about between 70 and 80% of them, felt that they were helped by the interview and that they needed no further assistance. So he then sort of got together with these two colleagues, Michael Hoyt and Robert Rosenbaum, and they started to kind of look into this from different perspectives. I think Talman was a more systemic therapist, Robert Rosenbaum was a psychodynamic therapist with an interest in Eastern religions, and Michael Hoyt was more of a strategic therapist. And so they got together and they did the first developmental work and research on planned single session therapy, because the work that Talman was doing was what he came to call single session therapy by default. In other words, you don't set out to do a single session or whatever, but it turns out to be a single session because the client has decided only to turn up once. Now, most of our language that we have in this field is viewing that negatively. The patient is deemed to have dropped out or terminated prematurely or attrition, and all those kind of words which are kind of certainly have, in my view, pejorative overtones. But in fact, what actually happens if you look now at the data of number of visits, you'll find across the board that the most frequent number of visits that occur in an agency, be it a governmental agency or a non-for-profit agency, is 1 followed by 2 followed by 3. So our clients are telling us something. Should we choose to listen to them? So incidentally, one of the things that I always sort of find amusing is that of all the groups that Talman, Hoyt and Rosenbaum said that we've got this new thing, would you like to give it a try? The group that said no were made up of psychologists, all right? So psychologists weren't interested, but the general public is. And I think that coming forward, I mean, I find that most of the resistance to single session therapy is by therapists.
I can see why that would make sense, because there's maybe a misalignment of incentives here. You know, if your income is dependent upon having clients come back to you more than once, then you might sort of lean away from single session therapy.
Well, but not if you're good at it and you get a good reputation. You get a number of referrals, you know. And so, that's true in private practice, but that's not necessarily true in agencies like the NHS and, governmental agencies where, you can wait ages. And I think one of the things that drew me to single session therapy was being interested in providing services to people at the point of their need, rather than at the point of the agency or the organization's ability to offer them an appointment. So, I think what single session therapy does is really to kind of see people quickly and help them as quickly as possible. Now, before you ask me another question, I just want to make clear that single session therapy does not necessarily mean one session and one session only. It means that we work together, the client and I, on the assumption that I will try to help them in one session, but that more help is needed if they request it. Now, they might request it at the end of the session. They may request it after an opportunity to put into practice anything that they've learned from the session and then come back. Or they may decide that they, thank you very much, that was useful. So it's not as it says. And I kind of was sort of saying, well, look, I mean, some people call it one at a time therapy. And I kind of have it in mind that I might, if I was going to change the name of what I do, it would be 1+ therapy, spelt capital O, capital N, capital E, and then plus in lowercase letters, which indicates, look, let's see if we can help you in one, but you can have more sessions, as in the plus. But so watch this space. I might launch that. Maybe even have launched it here, Niall.
It's a catchy name. I like it. So it seems that Windy, this is more of a mindset rather than like a specific approach or modality of therapy.
Yes, I think that's very, very true, and I'm glad that you spotted that. It's really a way of working that is open to a range of different approaches, and that's why I see often I often see sort of single system therapy as a form of pluralism in action, because you're not just doing this or that. It's both and. And it's open, as I say, to a variety of different approaches. But it is based on what's been called the single session mindset or single session thinking, which underpins that. And I think when people approach single session work based on what I call conventional therapeutic thinking or the conventional therapeutic mindset, that's when things start to break down.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Now, for any mental health professionals that are listening to this, and they're sort of wondering, okay, this sounds great, but why would you say this is important for people in the helping professions to be aware of, and in what way can it be beneficial for their therapeutic practice, would you say?
Well, because our clients are telling us that, particularly in agencies, that this is what we want. Not all of them are, of course, and of course, because this is really an approach which doesn't put limits on things. It's really saying, let me offer people what traditionally they haven't been offered, because if you look at what happens, somebody gets referred, eventually they see a therapist, and the first session, it's almost guaranteed that what the therapist isn't going to do is to use therapy from moment one, which is what we do in single session therapy. We get down to business quickly, and what I've started to do, even in my private practice, is when I ask people to fill in a little form, I've added the question: how many sessions are you prepared to come for? And it's interesting. Very few people say, well, I mean, some people say as long as it takes, but some people say, one or 1 to 4, And so I think people are interested in shorter, briefer work, and it's often therapists that are interested in doing longer term work.
100%. So you've mentioned previously that one of the foundational principles that this approach is built upon is that help is best provided at the point of need, whenever the client needs it most, and the quicker that they can get therapy at that moment, the better.
Yeah.
Why is that? And after you've answered that, I would be also curious to ask, what are the other foundational principles that single session therapy is built upon?
Right. So I think it's important because, when you're in pain, emotional, physical, I mean, I think it's the nature of being human that you want to kind of address that pain as quickly as possible. And I think most therapists come into the field, very few therapists come into the field saying, the reason I came into this field is to work with people who've been on a waiting list for 16 weeks. Therapist wants to help people quickly. The clients want to be helped up quickly. So let's see if we can organize it that we respond to that. And the more, if you're ready to go, if you're saying, okay, I now want to help, and you're put on a waiting list, and for an assessment or whatever it is, the longer you're on that waiting list, the more the kind of motivation to kind of to be helped tends to dwindle away. And so sometimes you get stories where people have gone to an agency for help, and it's been 20 weeks later, and they get a call. And they say, oh yeah, that's right. I did ring, but it's too late now, So, I mean, I think that, but actually one of the interesting points here is that quite often the NHS through the IAP program is constructed in a way to not take advantage of single session therapy, because they're very, very, very driven by, let's assess people, let's give people what we think that they need, right? And then they'll have to be put on a waiting list, you know, so that they get what we think they need. Whereas single session therapy is based more on actually, it's actually quite client-centered. It's saying, well, what do you need? You know, do you want to be helped now, or do you want to be put on a waiting list? We could do either. And if you ask people whether they want to be helped now or to be put on a waiting list, most of them want to be helped now. Not all of them, but most of them will.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Could you maybe tell us about Parkinson's law of psychotherapy? I think this is very important.
Well, Parkinson's law of psychotherapy kind of says that the time that you give therapy can contract or get what's the opposite of contract? Expand, that's it. Expand or contract. Therapy can expand or contract as long according to the time that you give it. So if you say to somebody, look, we've got you know, 3 sessions to do this piece of work, or you give them 3 months to do this piece of work, it's going to affect their behavior tremendously. Now, the reason why I think that's important is that I often talk about Rod Temperton. Have you heard of Rod Temperton?
No, I haven't.
Rod Temperton was a person born in Grimsby who actually ended up writing for Michael Jackson. He wrote Thriller. And Thriller is, I believe, one of the best-selling singles of all time. And it was written by a British man from Grimsby, which I always like anyway. So the story is this, you know, the bit, you know, towards the end of Thriller, where Vincent Price comes in and says, darkness, you know, rides across whatever it is. Now the story is this, that they decided that they needed somebody of distinction to actually voice that. And so they got in touch with Vincent Price, and he agreed to do it. He said, well, I can do this. I've got a gap tomorrow. Right. So they agreed at I think kind of 2 o'clock that he was going to come, and Rod Temperton said, oh, good. I've got some time that morning to write it, you know, to write those kind of, I think 5 verses he wrote, but I think only 4 verses were used. So at 9 o'clock he gets up, and then at the very moment he got up, you know, to start work on it, the doorbell rings, and it's his manager. And he hadn't put a meeting that he had with his manager, which he couldn't get out of, which lasted from 9 o'clock to about 12. So he leaves 12. He still hasn't written it, right? And so he drives to the studio, and as he's driving in, he sees Vincent Price getting out of the car to go into the studio. He hasn't written it yet. So he's got about 30 minutes to write, and he does it, right? Wow. Because that's what human beings do. We have a tremendous capacity to be creative and to help ourselves and to do things, you know, under certain circumstances. And, you know, I think that's a so great example. I often use that in my training courses to say, look, you know, we human beings have got the creativity and the, you know, under certain circumstances, we can actually kind of do a great deal to help ourselves. But if you say to people, oh, we've got 2 years to do this, you know, well, okay, fine. You know, it's a bit like, you know, at a university, you know, you've got 9 months to write an essay. When do you start it? You don't start it straight away, right?
100%. I'm actually just completing a dissertation. I'm doing a master's conversion in psychology at the minute, and the deadline is Friday of next week. And I'm very, very conscious of Parkinson's law now, because I don't want to be stressing out on Thursday night next week trying to get handed in. So,
well, but don't forget, if you are, don't forget to think of Rod Temperton.
It's true. That's true. That'll be my inspiration.
You can harness your inner Rod Temperton.
Okay. So Wendy, what would you say are the most common misconceptions people have about single session therapy?
that it's one session and one session only. Now it can be that, but again, so if somebody comes along and says to me, look, I'm only going to give you one session, or I only want to come for one session, then that's their choice. I'm not saying to them I'm only going to give them one session. Now, the only time I do one session and one session only is either when my client wants it or at my demonstrations, where it's sort of like, therapy demonstrations tend to be, one session only. I know that, the volunteer knows that, and that's a separate issue. But so I think that's the misconception, that you've only got that. The other misconception is it's only for mild problems. Now, if you look at the work that's been done in the States, Canada, and elsewhere on the effectiveness of single session based walk-in therapy, what they found is that people can walk in with complex and difficult issues and get something from that, and they get as much from that somebody who walks in with a very mild issue. So I think that's another kind of misconception, which is that it's only for kind of mild kind of problems.
Have you, sorry to interrupt, but have you thought about the potential application of single session therapy alongside psychedelic therapy? There's a big sort of movement in America with this at the moment. That would be another brief intervention. Have you thought about how those two could possibly be paired?
Well, I mean, I've heard, I sort of have, I don't know enough about psychedelic therapy to kind of really get involved with that. But, you've given me an idea, and I'm a great believer in taking ideas wherever I can get it. So I will have a look at that. And if you have any reading suggestions, Niall, I'll be only too pleased to receive them. Okay. I mean, I kind of, maybe I'm a bit, when people talk about psychedelic therapy, I always go back to when I took I actually, because I can't inhale smoke, I actually took pot in a cake and ended up in hospital with vomiting and diarrhea. Maybe that's clouding my judgment a little bit.
Okay. So I think maybe now just about pushback. We interviewed Mick Cooper for this summit as well, and the interview was on relational depth. And people from that sort of camp would be saying, relational depth is such a key aspect of therapeutic work. How can you get anywhere near that in a single session?
Well, you can have moments. I think there's a difference between having a relationship of depth and moments of relational depth. So if you look at the old film of Carl Rogers and Gloria, I think there are 2 to 3 minutes of 2 or 3 moments of relational depth. And also for her, it was a relationship of depth, because I think she kept in contact with him for years later. But you see, again, I say that the relational depth is important for some people, not for all. But I'm talking about what I call relational promptness, is to actually offer a relationship promptly, rather than that we all have to have a relationship of depth with our counselors and therapists in order to get something from that. I don't think that's true. I don't think Mick would say that was true. But there are times, and with certain people, that is key and crucial. And we can't offer that in single session therapy. And I think it's very important, because I think that transparency in all kinds of therapy is important, but particularly in single session work, that we're clear with clients what we can do, what we can't do. And if somebody comes to me and says, I want to have a deep relationship of depth with you in a single session, I'll say, sorry, I can't do that.
That's fair enough. So I was going to say you've got a gift for coming up with these terms: relational promptness and +1 therapy. You've got a bit of a talent.
No, there. Not +1, 1+.
1+. My apologies.
Right.
So yeah, I think now it would be a good time to maybe get into some of the best practices. So maybe to start off, Wendy, could you maybe tell us what happens before, during, and after a single session?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are certain, I mean, it depends upon where the single session therapy takes place. So, for example, if you're working in a walk-in service, and I believe even in a walk-in service, because when you walk in, you don't walk in straight away and see somebody. You walk in straight away and you probably wait for half an hour. Now, because we believe in utilizing time efficiently in single session work, the person would be asked to fill in a form to prepare for the session. So I think wherever possible, clients can be given the opportunity to prepare for the session and then share their preparation with the therapist. So for example, I work for an organization called Square Health. Now, Square Health is one of these organizations that um, offers a small number of sessions to clients that are members of various insurance companies. So some people get up to 8, some people get up to 6. And I've joined this organization because it offers like 30-minute sessions. And as it turns out, much of the time, like you would imagine, most of this you only see the person once. So what I do, and I don't think anybody else does that in terms of the other counselors, when I get a referral in, I write to them and I say, you've booked in to see me at such and such a date. I found it very helpful to ask people to prepare for the session and then to share their thinking with me. This is not mandatory, but if you want to do it, I think it will be helpful to both of us. And so I send them a form and they fill it out, and that helps them to kind of come a little bit prepared. So whenever possible, if you can encourage people to prepare for a session, then it's fine. But sometimes, for example, somebody might cancel in the morning and somebody else, goes on the app and finds that I am free that afternoon, and it comes in and I don't have the time to send them the form, or I have the time, but they don't have the time to fill it in. So, but I have found that once you ask people to give some thought to it, then that's helpful. So, and so you can actually start from there. Was filling in the form helpful to you? Has anything changed as a result of that? And then you can pick it up from there. But the thing about the practice is I like to start by saying something like, what's your understanding of the purpose of our conversation today? So it's quite clear that myself and the client have got kind of expectations about what's going to happen, which are congruent. Because if they say, oh, my understanding is you're going to take a full assessment and let me know whether I'm going to be suitable for long-term therapy, I'll say, well, that's not my understanding. So, we have to be kind of clear right from the start about, what we can and what we can't do. Now, having done that, and make sure that we're on the same page, I think then it's important to recognize, what do you want to get out of this session? What do you want to take away from this session that would make coming here today of value to you? And so I often say in my mind and to people is that single session therapy is not the end of something. It's often the beginning of something. It actually helps people to kind of take a few steps forward so that they can actually get on with the business of actually living kind of freed from some obstacle that you've helped them to kind of get freed from in the session. And so, but sometimes people say, I just found it very difficult, to kind of just come up with one thing. And I say, that's fine, and, we start with where they want to start. And so I'm quite flexible about the way I particular kind of start. It's geared to what the person wants. It's geared to what the person wants to take away. And then you're off and running.
It seems, just a very, very limited experience with this, but it seems that just by, getting clear on the intention beforehand and like preparing and reflecting afterwards, you are, I think it has the potential to sort of like 10x the effectiveness of a therapy session. It just seems like.
Sorry, what was that word? 10x?
Just like make it 10 times more effective.
Oh, right, 10 times more effective. Yeah. Well, you see, I'm now kind of thinking about, kind of helping people to adopt a single session mindset to more ongoing therapy, to actually kind of recognize that, that you can bring a single session mindset to people that you see ongoing by actually helping them to kind of say, what do you want to take away from today? They can always say, and as some of them do, they, because one of the things that I've got, and I might actually kind of, sort of read it out to you as we're talking, because I've got me kind of, pre-session questionnaire here. And so my last question is, what help do you hope I can best provide you in the session? Please check the main one. Help me to develop greater understanding of the issue. Just listen while I talk about the issue. Help me to express my feelings about the issue. Help me to solve an emotional or behavioral problem. Help me to get unstuck. Help me to make a decision. Help me to resolve a dilemma. Other, please specify. Now, what do you think people tick the most?
I would say, I'm not sure. Probably the other box, and then they would give a very specific problem because it encourages that kind of thinking. No,
very, very few people tick the other box.
I'm not sure. You're gonna have to tell me.
Help me to solve an emotional or behavioral problem. Help me get unstuck. Okay. Now, if you give this to a bunch of counselors and you say, how would you like to spend the session? They wouldn't say that. So that's why you've got to be, if you're doing this work, you do need to be guided by what the client wants, I'm afraid, not to try to persuade in some way the client to do what you want.
We're just talking about questions there. Just in preparing for this, one of the things I really liked about what you were saying about single session therapy is that whenever you're asking a client at the start of the session, you're not asking them what they want to get at the end of therapy. You're asking them what would they like to achieve by the end of that particular session. And that seems to really be effective. I'd be curious to ask, Wendy, what other questions do you find most beneficial to ask clients in therapy?
You mean in single session therapy or
generally, over the years, what have you found has really sort of moved the needle for you in therapy?
Well, I think, it's an interesting point. I think that one thing that I've come to ask is under what conditions, what condition would you need to actually either solve your problem or to move you forward? What would need to happen for you in life to actually help to move you forward? I think that one is because I like that, because we're going to be talking about REBT, in the future. But I like that because then you can have a discussion about whether it's possible for them to move forward, even if that ingredient is not present. So for example, I'll give you a typical example. One of my particular interests is to work with people who procrastinate, right? And in fact, when I was thinking about what I was going to be doing after I retired from Goldsmiths in 2014, it was a toss-up between developing single session therapy or opening up a clinic for people who procrastinate. And what swayed me was that I probably have much more chance of getting paid if I actually kind of work with a single session therapy, because people who procrastinate will procrastinate on paying you, you see. Anyway, but to actually say to people, okay, now, you know, what ingredient would you need, do you think, that would actually, you know, kind of tip the balance and have you start working on what you want to start working on? And they'll say things like, oh, well, if I had the motivation and if I felt confident, and so I say, okay, that's fine. Is it possible for you to start this piece of work without being confident? Is it possible for you to start this work without the motivation? And people come to realize, yes, it is, should they choose to do that. So I think that one question, I actually find really kind of, you know, useful. The other question, which I think, you know, is, you know, have you solved this problem before, but in a different time or a different area of your life? What did you do? And is it possible for you to transfer what you did from that situation to this situation? And that, I think that's a really great question to ask in single session therapy, because, you know, quite often people, I often say in single session therapy, one of my major tasks is to reintroduce the person to themselves as they were at a different point in their lives. Mm. So you say, okay, hi, this is Niall. This is the Niall that you know, here, you know, was able to do a piece of work, and so, you know, say hello to Niall and ask him how he did it, and then you can actually put it into practice. So I think that is that's a kind of useful kind of you know, question that you know, to ask. How have you solved this problem before? What's been helpful? What hasn't been helpful? Have you had the experience of being helped before by somebody outside of therapy? What did they do that you found helpful? And that's really kind of helping me to see, you know, can I replicate that for the person? So I think some of those. Now, of course, somebody from a different therapeutic approach would say, questions? I don't ask people questions.
100%. Yeah, no, I love that. And it's not only are you bringing awareness to what's worked in the past and trying to integrate that into what the client does after the session, you're also bringing awareness to what hasn't worked and then helping them to create some distance from that as well, which is...
Yeah. What I find now, particularly from my Square Health work, and the Square Health work is, you know, the reason I love it is you're seeing people from all kinds of walks of life in all different parts of the country. So, for example, this morning, I was working for somebody from Belfast, right? And then in the afternoon, I'm working with somebody from Devon. So the reason I like that is what occurs to me is that what, you know, when you ask people, what have you done to try to help with your anxiety or depression? And it's all after the fact. You know, they don't have an understanding or psychological understanding of what anxiety is and what people get anxious about. And I think that's one of the things that I've found that is actually kind of useful, is that you can actually, in a fairly brief period of time, if they're interested, give them a perspective of their anxiety or their depression or whatever it is they're coming from, that they can use and apply to their own lives. Because a lot of people say, well, I go to the gym or I take long walks. And look, I'm not knocking that. And I think that's a great thing to do, but it's not necessarily a psychologically oriented solution. It's like, you know, what to do after you've made yourself anxious or depressed, rather than dealing with, you know, the issues, you know, about, you know, that people either make themselves anxious or depressed about in the first place. So I think that certain amount of psychological education, you know, is actually quite useful when you can do that in a single session.
100%. Now, a question that you mentioned in your weekend university talk a couple of years ago that I really liked was, what do I need to know about your history that will be crucial in order for me to help you today? So you're just getting into focus on the parts that are most relevant to the current problem.
Yeah. You know? You see, again, there are certain things, you know, I often say that there are certain activities which, in and of themselves are not necessarily problematic, like, you know, taking a history, doing a full assessment, doing a case formulation before you intervene. I mean, that you know, I don't have anything against that, but I do have, that's not a good use of time, you know, to use in the single session. So I'm always looking for kind of really quick ways, you know, of doing things, and that's a good question. The other question that people ask is, you know, what about risk? And I say, well, you know, you can, you know, if somebody is showing signs of risk, you do exactly what you do in a single session in other areas. But I think, you know, to ask people the questions, you know, can I ask you some direct questions? Is that okay with you? And you see, I often think if you ask people's permission to do things in life and in therapy, they're much more understanding and they're much more open to it. So I might say to you, Niall, if you're in single session therapy, I might go, you know, can I ask you a direct question? You say yes. You know, have you are you having, or have you recently had thoughts about taking your own life? You know, do you feel at risk to yourself or to others? And if the person says, no, I haven't, then that's your risk assessment, right? So if they say yes, then that's a different matter. So you know, I think that if you can abbreviate things, and again, if they say, you know, it also depends on how they say yes. I'm not naive just to say that you just listen to the words. You have to listen to the music. But you know, generally speaking, if you have to ask those questions, and some agencies mandate their counsellors to always do a risk assessment, you can do it fairly quickly. And if you need to do it more extensively, you can.
No, that's a great point. Definitely. Now, a couple of the other best practices you mentioned that I really sort of thought would be valuable, were asking, okay, at the start of the session, asking, is it okay if I interrupt you during the session?
Yeah.
I thought that was really cool. And then the other thing was, at the end of the session, you're asking the client to summarize their key takeaway. You don't summarize for them.
That's right.
Summarize.
Okay. I mean, you can actually bring it together, or you could do it separately. You might say, okay, you know, would you, you know, as we're coming to the end, would you like to summarize what we've covered? Which they do, and then I might at a point, you know, if I need to, and then I might ask the question, you know, what are you going to take away from that, you know, from that summary, and actually implement that's going to, you think that's going to kind of be helpful? Or you can combine the two. You know, what would you like to, you know, can you just indicate to me what are the main points of the session that you're going to implement, you know, and you're going to take away from this? Because you know, it's not about, you know, negotiating specific homework assignments. It's about more of a takeaway plan. And I've noticed anyway that in therapy, the words takeaway seem to be replacing homework assignments, and the implementation of a takeaway. You know, I think that's you know, that's a kind of useful thing to do.
And do you think it's just be one thing that they take away, or a very, very small number of things? What would you recommend for someone?
It's going to depend. You know, I think that you know, sometimes it's 2 or 3 things that kind of people are going to take away, and I do encourage people to take notes, as a matter of fact. You know, I actually start off by saying, you know, would you think it might be useful to kind of make any notes as we talk? You know, occasionally they say, well, can you make the notes for me and let me have a copy at the end? And I say, no, that's not my job. You know, my job is to kind of, you know, help you to be as active as you can, you know. But yeah, I mean, to kind of really have somebody to jot down as we go, because sometimes people say something, oh, well, that's good, let me just kind of make a note of that. Sometimes I might say something, and I might say, "Oh, wait a minute, that sounds good. Let me make a note of what I just said." Yeah, so I think that really the takeaway, is at least one. But what you don't want to do, and I think this is where I mentioned earlier how you can take, if you bring a conventional therapeutic mindset to single session therapy, people think, oh, I've only got one session, I've got to make sure that people take away as much as they can, And I often say that's a bit like when I used to visit my mother, and she wouldn't be happy unless at the end of the visit, I would take away a chicken, a loaf of bread, a packet of biscuits, a cake that she baked me, some fruit, and then she would know that I wouldn't go hungry over the next few days. You do that, people will take away nothing because it's too much for them. They get clouded. So it's a minimum of one, but don't push too much. And some counselors, they get that, but then they email the client afterwards with all these links and apps. Don't do that unless the client has asked for that, because again, it's more to satisfy the idea I've covered the basics. And that's why we say in single session therapy, less is more and more is less.
100%. 100%. I've had one experience of single session therapy, and it was combined with chair work, and it was done via Zoom. And I found the experience very, very helpful. And
who was that with, by the way?
With a guy, you might know him, Matthew Pugh.
He was one of my students on my second single session therapy course. So yeah,
there you go.
He does, and I think he does great work. The only thing I would say is that I don't want to only do chair work in single session therapy. I would do chair work if it's called for, but I'm sure he would agree with me.
Yeah, no, as I was saying, I did find it very beneficial. And one of the things that Matthew did after the session was he sent me the recording, and then I was out for a run the following week, and I just decided to listen to the recording. And I think I got as much benefit from listening to the recording as the session itself. I don't know, for me as a client, I found that it was just, yeah, very helpful. So I'm just curious, do you encourage therapists to send recordings if they have the option to?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll come back to recording because that's an interesting issue. But I mean, what I do in my demonstrations is that I will record them, and then if you want a copy of it, you can email me. I'll send you a copy of it, and I will also get a transcript made of it and send you. Now in my private practice, it's not cost effective, so if you want that, you'd have to pay for it. But if you're offering somebody a demonstration and they're volunteering, they're doing you the honor of volunteering, then I think you can offer them a recording and a transcript. So yeah, some people love the transcript, some people love the recording, some people don't want either. Some people, you say to people, would you like me to record this? They say no. People are different, and in single session therapy, we don't foist anything on people. We just say, okay, fine, that's okay. Now, in terms of recording, I think that in a way, one of the best ways of training people in single session therapy after they've done the initial kind of training course is to have them make recordings of their work and then bring those recordings to supervision. It's like pulling teeth, Niall. Therapists don't want to do that. They really don't.
Why?
What?
Why do you think?
Well, what do you think?
It's probably not nice to see when you're making mistakes and stuff.
That's right. Yeah, people don't want to do that. I mean, they say, but they probably had to do that when they were training, initially. But I find that if you ask somebody to talk about a session, they'll talk about it. But then if they play a recording of it, it bears very little relation to what they're talking about. And so, I like to kind of, I mean, I supervise some people who do single session work, And and they, of course, it's all done with the permission of the client, of course, that they send the recording, and and I'm listening to this recording, and it gives me a much keener insight in terms of what they need to do, is rather than if they tell me what they do. Hearing what people do is much more informative than them telling you what to do. Although sometimes, doing both is important too.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So just we're sort of nearing the end here, Wendy. Before we finish up, could you maybe tell us about the single session mindset, or single session therapy mindset, and about the clock that you have in your office, or at least that you used to have in your office?
Yeah, the clock is called the Now clock. You've heard of the Now show. This is the Now clock. And so instead of having 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's got now, 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 now. So you said, what's the time? It's 3 minutes past now, right? And that's really to show that in a way, all you know is that you and your client are here now. And since you don't know if the client's going to come back, they don't know if they're going to come. You don't know if you're going to come back. And as I get older, that question becomes, more acute with me. So why not capitalize on what we have now? And that's part of the single session mindset. Approaching the session as if it could be the first and only time you see somebody is a very important part of the session, rather than approaching the session as if it is the first amongst amongst many. Like agencies, I think they're doing this less now, but they used to give everybody 6 sessions, right? Whether they needed it or not. So again, Parkinson's law, if you give 6 sessions and people stay around, they'll take all 6. You give them, you don't do that, and they may be finished after 1. So I think partly the traffic jam in agencies is partly due to that. And what we know is that if we reduce the 6 sessions to 4 sessions, there's still it lessens the traffic jam, but there's still a jam. You actually introduce single session therapy, although that's not the purpose of doing so. It actually kind of does make the access much more smooth and less jammy, if you like. So that's an important, sort of part of the mindset, approaching the session as if it could be the last, rather than approaching the session that it's going to be the first, of many. Approaching the session being keen to really have the client, specify what they want to take from it. And unless there's a good reason to question that, to go along with it. And so those are the aspects of the mindset that I think are really, quite key.
I think there's so much power in that, just for everyday life as well. If you're approaching every relationship in your life with the knowledge that this could be the last time you see this person, I think you're likely to treat them a lot better as well and enjoy their company a lot more.
That's interesting. So many people say, I wish I kissed my husband and told him how much I loved him. I didn't do that because I knew he was coming back, but he wasn't. So maybe this is a good place to end, and that is to kind of always show your loved ones that you love them, because you never know whether that may be the last time you see them.